Don't smile until Christmas. This advice to new teachers in September in schools reveals just how dangerous humour is considered to be in the classroom. Well, that is the received wisdom. It couldn't be more wrong. When I was 10, I caused much mirth in class. When, fond of daydreaming, I was hauled back into reality and humiliation by the teacher who demanded me to explain to the class about Magna Carta. So I stood up and said, Magna Carta was a very great man. As a young teacher, I took the job too seriously, and though not a martinet, I tended to interpret any impertinence of the students as a way of undermining my authority. Then I learned that my nickname was Volcano. Well, this upset me and changed my behaviour. I learned to relax and enjoy humour as it appeared. Then I learned how humour can be used as a tool to dispel tension, to establish better relations with pupils and classes, and to allow you to be yourself, and even to change behaviour. Well, classroom humour takes many forms. Howlers, non sequiturs, ludicrous questions, cheek, banter, and occasionally wit. Howlers are supposed to be innocent mistakes made by pupils, though we can never know how many were invented by teachers and authors and how many contrived by the students. For example, Ferdinand Magellan circumcised the world with a 50-foot cutter. One naive howler came from a primary school boy I taught. He renamed Florence Nightingale from the lady with the lamp to the woman with a light, as if she were the cigarette girl at the Balaclava Odeon. A teacher I knew told me the story of a boy who was winded when a basketball hit him hard in the stomach. The teacher went to the trouble of explaining to the boy that he'd been hit in the solar plexus. Well, the next day, the mother of the boy appeared at the school and demanded to know why a teacher had told her son that he'd been hit in the sexual polar. At adult level, similar howlers occur, especially with students of English as an alternative language. An Italian student was asked to describe what Naples was like when Italy won the 1982 Football World Cup. He said, "Oh, it was amazing. Naples was one big traffic marmalade." Another adult student decided to extend her vocabulary by buying a thesaurus, unaware of the dangers of synonyms. She wrote in a splendid story, "The city looked beautiful from a distance, but close up I could see hemorrhoids of rubbish everywhere." Non sequiturs usually occur when a student has been daydreaming and suddenly articulates their curiosity. They often sound surreal in the context of a class. For example, in the middle of a fairly intense English lesson, when the students were asking some brilliant questions about the novel, one boy asked, "Where did you buy your shirt?" I did laugh, as did the class. On another occasion, when I mentioned that it was exactly 200 years since the French Revolution began, one girl sighed and said, "Doesn't time fly?" Innocent but fatuous questions can also be a source of amusement. Questions like, when was Robin Hood the Prime Minister? My reply was, all the time actually, except they usually steal from the poor to give to the rich. Another question I was asked in all seriousness was, "So did Henry VIII and Winston Churchill get along?" My reply was, even if they hadn't lived 400 years apart, I don't think they would have hit it off as friends. Got me thinking about figures of history who lived at different times meeting each other. For example, Abraham Lincoln and Donald Trump, or Napoleon Bonaparte and Margaret Thatcher. The list is endless. A cheek is the most common form of humour in school. It can be barbed or it can be genuinely amusing. If barbed, my advice to teachers is don't take it too seriously and personally. Teachers are targets to some pupils. An example of pure cheek was exemplified by a student who asked me, "Did Richard III say anything to you about school uniform?" Although I'm a Ricardian, I was tempted to reply, "He said the cheeky boys should be smothered in their sleep." But I didn't say it since the image was too grim whether you knew about the princes in the tower or not. A wonderfully cheeky answer was given to me by an adult student who missed a lesson in my course. The next day I asked her why she had been absent. She smiled and said, "I was too well to attend." The best excuse I ever received. Cheek can often lead to banter. Knowing how far to go with cheek and banter is a fine art, mastered quite instinctively by a surprisingly large number of students. Some years ago I taught in a secondary school in London. One afternoon, as I passed by the head teacher's office, a boy I knew, seated near the office, beckoned me over. He then told me that he'd been put on detention and asked if I could get him out of it. I replied, "Of course not. I can't cancel another teacher's detention, let alone the head teacher's." As I walked off, I heard the boy say, "I won't forget this." As I turned, about to ask, "Forget what?" I saw a twinkle in his eye and the beginnings of a smile. Students can be quite witty, sometimes not at the expense of a teacher's dignity. One amusing response came from a schoolboy I taught. I was busy telling the class the story of Archimedes and how he cried "Eureka" in his bath when he realised that displacement of water could be used to measure weight. As the story goes, he was so excited by this discovery that he ran to the palace naked to tell the king the news. At this point of the story, a boy asked, "Was the queen at the palace when Archimedes arrived?" Irritated by this facetious question, I snapped, "I have no idea." Whereupon the boy continued, "Oh yes, I read about it somewhere. She said, 'Jeeves, hand me my opera glasses, would you?'" One story about teenage wit comes not from school, but from a courtroom in 1946. Another place where humour is considered dangerous. It is worth repeating this story. After World War II, many sites in London were bomb damaged and unsafe, but boys, in this case some East End boys, kept playing football on the sites. They were warned several times by the police that the sites were dangerous, and if they continued to play football, they would be hauled into court. One day a police officer saw a boy lining up a football on one of these sites, aiming to kick the ball between two pieces of timber. Exasperated, the officer took the boy to the police station. The next morning the boy faced a magistrate in court. He repeated the charge, which stated that the boy was playing football on a forbidden site. The boy spoke up and said, "But I wasn't playing football." The magistrate replied, "No, but you were going to play football, and going to play is as bad as playing." To which the boy retorted, "Well, then, if I'm fined, going to pay is as good as paying." Humour can be also used to deal with behavioural problems. Two examples of this I would like to share with you. I heard of a housemaster at an English public school who on his day off visited the racecourse. He suddenly found himself standing next to a boy from his school. He glared at the lad, who looked up and said, "Oh, you're Mr. Wilson, aren't you? You teach my identical twin brother James. Please give him my best wishes when you see him next." The housemaster, impressed by the boy's quick-witted response, said, "Yes, I will," and the boy quickly disappeared. That night, back at the school, the housemaster saw the boy from the racecourse and said to him, "Oh, James, I saw your identical twin brother today at the races. If I see you or your brother again at the racecourse, there will be trouble." The founder of Summerhill School, A.S. Neal, used humour a lot when dealing with the students. One story of a boy at the school gives an insight into how Neal worked. The boy was an inveterate liar and a very good mimic. One Friday morning, Neal received a call from the boy's father requesting that his son come to London for the weekend, and would Neal please put him on the 5 o'clock train and give him £10 for the ticket. The father reassured Neal that he would pay him when he saw him next. Neal agreed, but then he suspected that the call had come from the boy impersonating his father, calling from a telephone box near the school. So Neal put his theory to the test. At lunch he went to the boy, told him about the conversation with his father, and gave him £10. Half an hour later, Neal went back to the boy and said, "Oh, your father just phoned back. He made a mistake. The fare isn't £10, it's £12. And with that he gave the boy the extra £2 and walked off. As Neal put it, it took about 10 minutes before the lad came into my office, slammed the £12 on my desk and said, "You're a better actor than I am." He didn't lie much after that. A few years after I left my last school, I bumped into a former pupil who was at the school after I left. I asked the boy what the school was like by the time he left, and he replied, "The laughter police were everywhere." Unfortunately, humour is less appreciated and considered more subversive than ever. I once heard a teacher say to a class, "You're not here to have fun, you're here to learn," as if the two are mutually exclusive. Not so, as I have discovered.